whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive. You've heard the name before, softened by carols, snow, and a story that feels safely moral. The melody is familiar, the image is warm, and the lesson seems simple. But the figure at the center of this video is not the harmless saint from the songbook. He is a king born into one of the most carefully engineered power systems medieval Europe had ever seen, and he becomes the stress test that reveals how fragile that system really was. This isn't a neat rise and fall fable. It's a slow unspooling. Authority that looks immense on paper. Legitimacy that depends on rituals and alliances. And a political world where a single weak link can turn stability into a chain reaction. And when that chain reaction starts, it doesn't stay confined to one court or one crown, it spills outward, feeding the conflicts that will haunt Central Europe for generations. So if you want to understand how Europe could be calm on the surface while drifting toward rupture, start here before the scandals, before the factional wars, before the reputation hardens into myth. Now, picture the year 1361 and picture Nuremberg. It begins with a name that most people think they already know, even if they have never opened a medieval chronicle in their life. Wenceslaus. In English, the name often appears in a Christmas carol about a good king, a ruler who steps into the snow to bring help to the poor. The melody is familiar, the image is warm, and the moral is simple. But the man we are about to follow is not that saint from the song. He is a different Wenceslaus, separated by centuries and by temperament. He is Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, a king crowned twice, heir to an imperial machine built by one of the most careful statesmen of the late Middle Ages, and yet a ruler who spends much of his life in an uneasy fog of suspicion, frustration, and missed chances. His story is not a neat parable. It is the kind of story history often prefers, a life where power is enormous, but control is fragile, and where a single personality can speed up forces that are already pushing a society toward rupture. If you like hearing history, told as a living human drama full of motives, choices, and consequences, then subscribe and stay close. There are many more journeys like this, and it's easier to notice the patterns of the past when we keep walking them together. Now, picture the year 1361, and watch Nuremberg, an imperial city that feels like a crossroads of the German world. Its streets are busy with merchants and messengers, its halls filled with officials and nobles who speak in the language of empire. That is where Wenceslaus is born on February 26. His birth is not a private family event. It is a public signal, the arrival of a dynastic future. His father is Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, a man whose life is a masterclass in medieval statecraft. Charles has raised Prague into a cultural capital. He has founded a university there, created laws that shape imperial elections, and turned Bohemia into a central pillar of imperial politics. Charles does not simply rule. He builds systems, and he thinks in generations. Wenceslaus arrives into that system like a jewel set into a crown. The boy is meant to embody continuity. He is meant to guarantee that the careful architecture of Charles's rule will not collapse the moment Charles's hands release it. You can almost feel the intention behind the nursery walls. This child will be the next link in a chain that must not break. To understand the pressure on this child, you have to understand how unusual Charles's achievement is. The Holy Roman Empire is not a unified kingdom with one capital and one line of succession. It is a web of princes, bishops, dukes, imperial cities, monasteries, and ancient privileges. Its emperor is not automatically inherited like a modern throne. Imperial authority is tied to election, negotiation, and ritual. It is a title that must be won, and then constantly defended, not only against foreign threats but against the natural friction inside a realm where local rulers guard their autonomy like treasure. If a king of France can command with the idea of a single royal crown, the king of the Romans must command with persuasion, patience, and constant presence. He must travel, he must listen, he must mediate. He must make the electors feel respected, while also ensuring they do not become too independent. He must balance the interests of German princes, Italian ambitions, papal pressures, and the needs of cities that guard their liberties fiercely. Charles IV has learned how to navigate that web. He is a ruler who knows how to persuade electors, how to trade favors for votes, how to turn documents into power. In the year 1356, he issues the Golden Bull, a foundational legal framework that clarifies the electoral process and strengthens the position of the prince-electors. This is not a small administrative act. It is an attempt to make the empire's most dangerous uncertainty, succession, more predictable. And Bohemia sits at the heart of this, because the king of Bohemia is one of the prince-electors. That means the Bohemian crown is not a local ornament, it is an imperial instrument. When Charles strengthens Bohemia, he strengthens his leverage inside the empire. So when Wenceslaus is born, he is not only a son, he is a piece of imperial engineering. From his earliest years, his life is surrounded by ceremonies meant to lock the future into place. In 1363, when he is only about 2 years old, Wenceslaus is crowned King of Bohemia. The ceremony is symbolic, because no toddler can govern. But symbolism is governance in the Middle Ages. The coronation says, in public and in sacred space, that succession is settled. It tells nobles that the dynasty is stable. It tells rivals that the throne is occupied. It tells foreign courts that the line will continue. Imagine that moment in Prague. A child too small to understand the weight of the crown, dressed in miniature finery, surrounded by bishops, nobles, and the soft thunder of chanting. Men who have fought, bargained, and schemed all their lives, kneel and swear loyalty to a future that cannot yet speak. The act is not about the child's abilities. It is about the father's message. Charles is telling the kingdom and the empire that chance will not be allowed to decide what he has built. As Wenceslaus grows, his education is designed to produce a ruler who can carry both the Bohemian crown and the imperial future. He is raised in the orbit of Prague Castle, in a court that has grown wealthy and cultured under Charles IV. Prague is not merely a city, it is a statement. It has new stone bridges, grand churches, busy markets, and the newest kind of institution that signals intellectual ambition, a university. Wenceslaus is surrounded by tutors, scholars, clerics, and courtiers. He is taught Latin, the language of administration and church life. He is taught etiquette, because etiquette is not just manners, it is political performance. He is trained in riding, hunting, and warfare, because kings are expected to lead by presence. He is taught the shapes of law and diplomacy, because in the empire, a careless phrase can trigger a feud. Yet already, observers begin to notice something that will define his adult life. He is clever, quick-witted, perceptive, even charming at times, but he does not display the disciplined patience that his father embodies. He does not seem to enjoy long administrative labor. He prefers diversions that feel immediate. Hunting, courtly entertainments, the company of friends, pleasures that do not demand the slow grind of building coalitions. It is important to be fair here. We are hearing these impressions through the lens of people who often judge rulers by results and by expectations. A prince raised in luxury can look frivolous compared with a father who fought for every inch of authority. Also, foreign diplomats and disappointed nobles have incentives to exaggerate the weaknesses of a ruler they dislike. Gossip is an ancient form of politics. The most delicious scandal often comes from outsiders who write home with sharp observations so their own courts can feel superior. Still, a pattern emerges again and again. Wenceslaus has talent, but his talent is not managerial. He can speak sharply, but he struggles to follow through. He can see a problem, but he does not always build a plan. He can reward quickly, resent quickly, and retreat quickly. Charles IV, however, presses forward. He wants his son anchored into imperial legitimacy before uncertainty can grow. In 1376, when Wenceslaus is 15, Charles orchestrates his election as King of the Romans. This title matters. In the imperial structure, the King of the Romans is the elected ruler expected to become Holy Roman Emperor, usually after a further coronation and recognition. It is the throne in waiting, the official heirship. The election is not automatic. It requires the votes of the prince-electors, and those votes can be contested. Some electors grumble. They see Charles tightening the dynasty's grip on the empire. They fear the empire becoming, in practice, hereditary under the Luxembourg house. They worry about their own autonomy. But Charles is skilled. He negotiates, persuades, and wins the necessary support. On July 6, 1376, Wenceslaus is crowned at Aachen, a place weighted with memory. Aachen is associated with Charlemagne, the great Frankish ruler crowned emperor in the year 800. To be crowned at Aachen is to step into a long corridor of imperial myth. It is a way of saying, this is not merely politics, this is destiny. And yet, beneath the ceremony, doubts are already stirring. Some observers notice that the young king's attention wavers during solemn moments. Some interpret his jokes and restlessness as youth. Others interpret them as warning signs. A boy who cannot hold still during ritual may struggle to hold together an empire built on ritual and negotiation. For a few years, however, the machinery continues to run because Charles IV is still alive. The father's gravity holds the structure in place. Even if Wenceslaus is imperfect, Charles's authority stabilizes the system around him. Then, in 1378, Charles IV dies. It is a moment that changes the temperature of the entire realm. When a giant leaves the room, everyone suddenly hears the smaller noises, the murmurs of nobles, the grinding of local disputes, the distant rumble of unrest. The son now holds the titles without the father's shadow to hide beneath. Wenceslaus inherits the Bohemian crown and the title of King of the Romans. In theory, he stands at the center of a vast political web. In practice, he faces a problem that ruins many dynastic successions. He inherits a system that was built for the personality of his father. Charles IV governed through careful coalition building and constant attention to imperial balance. Wenceslaus does not share the same instincts. Instead of traveling widely through the empire to court electors and mediate disputes, he spends more time in Bohemia. Instead of convening frequent imperial assemblies, he withdraws into a smaller circle. Instead of projecting steadiness, he seems moody, reactive, and sometimes unpredictable. This does not mean he is unintelligent. It means he rules like a person whose inner weather changes quickly. And in the Holy Roman Empire, inner weather matters. The empire's elites are not passive subjects. They are partners, rivals, and judges. If they sense weakness, they press. If they sense absence, they fill the vacuum. If they sense that the king is not listening, they stop attending. To see how quickly this can happen, imagine the imperial world as a set of spinning plates. Each plate is a prince with his own interests, a bishop with his own jurisdiction, a city with its own liberties. Charles IV walked among these plates, steady hands, constant attention, keeping them spinning. Wenceslaus steps into the same room and does not move as quickly, does not touch as many plates, and soon you hear the wobble. Over the year 1380 and 1390, this wobble becomes visible. Wenceslaus's relationship with the nobility grows strained in Bohemia and beyond. One recurring theme is favoritism. All medieval rulers have favorites. They rely on trusted companions, advisors, and household officials. But favoritism becomes dangerous when it is perceived as unstable, arrogant, or insulting to traditional elites. Wenceslaus is said to elevate men of modest birth or minor status into influential positions. Whether he does this out of personal trust, out of spite against high nobles, or out of a desire to break old power blocks, the effect is the same. The higher nobility feels sidelined. That feeling hardens into resentment. In Bohemia, the nobility is not a single unified class. There are Czech nobles and German nobles, and their interests do not always align. There are great magnates with vast lands and smaller lords who depend on alliances. There are urban elites in Prague and other towns who have their own ambitions. Bohemia is prosperous, enriched by trade and by resources such as silver from regions like Kutná Hora. Prosperity brings opportunity, but also competition over who controls wealth and offices. Silver matters more than people today might guess. In late medieval politics, coin is loyalty. A king who can mint reliable money can pay troops, reward supporters, and fund building projects that signal legitimacy. Mining districts generate not only wealth, but disputes. Who owns the rights? Who taxes the production? Who controls the towns that grow around the mines? Who judges conflicts between miners and lords? A disciplined ruler can use such wealth to strengthen central authority. A wavering ruler can watch wealth become a prize fought over by factions. Wenceslaus's court becomes the arena where that competition turns bitter. He also clashes with parts of the church hierarchy, and this conflict becomes both political and personal. In medieval Bohemia, bishops and archbishops are not only religious leaders, they are landholders and political players. Disputes over appointments, church property, and legal jurisdiction can become fierce. When a king and an archbishop collide, it is rarely a polite theological debate. It is a struggle over authority. One of the most dramatic conflicts involves the Archbishop of Prague, Jan of Genstein, and a dispute over church governance. The dispute hardens around questions like these. Can the king influence church appointments and the management of church estates? Or does the church stand as a separate authority? In the background is the king's need to control his realm and the church's insistence on its own legal rights. The year 1393, the conflict turns deadly. A church official connected with the archbishop's administration is arrested, brutalized, and killed, with the body thrown into the river. Later memory will wrap this figure in saintly legend, and later politics will use the story for many purposes. The exact details are debated, but the political meaning is hard to miss. It signals that Wenceslaus's court can be ruthless in power struggles, and it deepens distrust between the crown and the higher clergy. At the same time, Wenceslaus's personal style does not help. He is said to swing between bursts of anger and long silences. In councils, he can be sharp and sarcastic, cutting down ideas without offering clear replacement policy. A king who mocks his advisors might feel powerful in the moment, but he also teaches them that counsel is dangerous and that loyalty is unappreciated. Over time, people stop giving honest advice and start giving flattery, or they stop attending entirely. Foreign observers notice these traits. Some call him eccentric, some call him unstable. Some might be exaggerating for diplomatic effect, but even exaggeration is a sign. The king is giving people material to exaggerate. As tensions grow, Wenceslaus's style creates openings for others. One of the most important figures in this drama is his half-brother Sigismund. Sigismund is a different kind of man. He is ambitious, politically sharp, and patient in a way Wenceslaus rarely is. While Wenceslaus withdraws, Sigismund expands his own position, gaining claims and titles in other regions, including Hungary. He learns how to build networks of loyalty and how to use crises to his advantage. The relationship shifts over time, sometimes cooperative, sometimes suspicious, sometimes openly hostile. In the end, Sigismund's trajectory rises while Wenceslaus's sinks. But before we follow Sigismund's ascent, we need to see how Wenceslaus's authority breaks in Bohemia itself. In the year 1394, dissatisfaction among nobles reaches a dramatic peak. A coalition of disaffected lords seizes Wenceslaus. The king is abducted while away from the security of Prague, reportedly during a hunting outing. Hunting is often portrayed as royal leisure, but it is also political theater. The king in the forest, surrounded by companions, relaxed. That relaxation can become vulnerability. The nobles imprison him in a castle, away from his supporters. They present the act not as treason, no one wants the label of traitor, but as reform, as a necessary intervention to rescue the realm from mismanagement. They claim they are saving the kingdom from the king's favorites, from confusion, from neglect, from the slow bleeding of authority. The image is shocking, a crowned king taken like a hostage by his own aristocracy. This moment reveals something crucial about late medieval power. A crown does not automatically command obedience. Authority is a balance. It rests on cooperation, on the perception of competence, and on a web of mutual benefit. When that balance breaks, even the sacred aura of kingship can be pierced. Wenceslaus is eventually released, and Sigismund plays a key role in negotiating that release. On the surface, it looks like family rescue. Underneath, it is also a power play. Sigismund gains leverage, extracting concessions and strengthening his own influence. Wenceslaus is forced to dismiss some advisors and promise greater respect for noble privileges. The nobles do not merely want the king freed. They want him changed, or at least constrained. Wenceslaus returns to Prague altered. The experience does not make him suddenly disciplined or universally respected. Instead, it marks him as vulnerable, as a ruler whose authority can be challenged directly. The nobles now know they can force concessions. The king now knows he cannot ignore them forever. This is where Wenceslaus's reign becomes a slow unraveling rather than an immediate collapse. He still holds the Bohemian crown. He still has supporters. Bohemia is still a wealthy and strategically important kingdom. But the relationship between king and elite is damaged, and the damage spreads into every decision. While these internal struggles play out, Europe itself is transforming. The late 14th century is a time of deep instability. The Black Death has torn through Europe in earlier decades, killing vast numbers and leaving economic and social disruption behind. Labor shortages shift power. Peasants demand higher wages. Lords struggle to maintain old feudal obligations. Cities grow. Trade networks tighten. Money becomes more central to politics. Older hierarchies begin to creak. At the same time, the church enters a crisis that damages its moral authority, the Great Western Schism. Beginning in 1378, rival popes claim legitimacy, each excommunicating the other, each dragging kingdoms into their orbit. For ordinary believers, the spectacle is confusing and disturbing. If the church's highest office can fracture, what does that say about unity, truth, and authority? Bohemia is not immune. In some ways, it becomes a crucible for these tensions. especially because of its university. The University of Prague, founded by Charles IV in the year 1348, draws scholars and students from across Europe. A university is not only a school, it is a generator of ideas and a place where questions become dangerous. Debates about theology quickly become debates about power, because theology touches the legitimacy of institutions. And here enters one of the most consequential voices of the period, Jan Hus. Hus was born around the year 1370 in southern Bohemia. He studies at Prague and rises through its ranks, becoming a prominent theologian and preacher. He is associated with Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, where he preaches in Czech. That choice matters. Latin is the language of church authority. Preaching in the vernacular speaks directly to ordinary people, bypassing some of the distance that Latin creates. To preach in Czech is not automatically heresy, but it signals a shift. Religion is becoming more publicly accessible, and authority is being challenged through language. Hus is influenced by earlier reformist thought, including ideas associated with the English theologian John Wycliffe. He emphasizes scripture as a primary authority, and criticizes corruption in the church, clerical wealth, moral hypocrisy, the selling of spiritual benefits, and the gap between the church's ideals and its behavior. To many ordinary people and reform-minded intellectuals, Hus's sermons feel like fresh air. To many church leaders, they feel like a threat. And to many nobles and city leaders, they feel like a tool that can be used against rivals. Where does Wenceslaus stand? This is one of the most revealing aspects of his personality. Wenceslaus does not appear to be deeply interested in theology for its own sake. He does not behave like a ruler, burning with reformist conviction. Instead, he behaves like a politician who recognizes an opportunity. Wenceslaus has been in conflict with elements of the high clergy. Some church leaders are aligned with noble factions that oppose him. Some resist his appointments and policies. In that environment, a popular preacher who criticizes corrupt clergy can be useful. Supporting or tolerating Hus can weaken Wenceslaus's opponents and shift the balance in Prague. So for a time, Hus enjoys a degree of protection. He preaches, he teaches, his influence grows. But as Hus's movement expands, it becomes less controllable. It is one thing to use reformist sentiment as a tool in court politics. It is another when reform becomes a mass phenomenon that questions the foundations of authority. One moment that captures this growing tension is the crisis over the university itself. The University of Prague is divided in its voting and identity structure between different nations, broadly representing groups of students and masters. As Czech pride and reformist sentiment grow, disputes sharpen between Czech and German factions within the university. In 1409, Wenceslaus issues a decree at Kutná Hora that changes the voting balance in favor of the Czech nation, giving it a dominant share. Supporters see it as justice and national empowerment. Opponents see it as political manipulation and exclusion. The outcome is dramatic. Many German masters and students leave Prague, and their departure helps spark the founding and strengthening of other universities, including Leipzig. Prague's intellectual life changes shape, becoming more strongly tied to Czech reform currents. The exodus changes more than lecture halls. It changes the mood of the city. Prague has long been a bilingual and multicultural capital, where Czech and German communities live side by side, trade with one another, and argue with one another. Under Charles IV, that mix could feel like imperial confidence. Prague is a bridge between worlds. Under Wenceslaus, the same mix becomes a fault line. When one group believes it is losing influence in the courts and the university, it tends to look for allies outside Bohemia, and it tends to describe reform not as renewal but as rebellion. You can see this tension even in ordinary scenes. Imagine a market day on the old town square. A Czech artisan sells cloth beside a German merchant who has networks along the Rhine. They speak enough of each other's tongue to bargain, but their jokes carry edge. A student passes by, arguing about scripture, while a priest shakes his head and mutters that the university has become arrogant. A noble steward collects dues from a shopkeeper who complains that the king's officials are inconsistent. Everyone is living, trading, arguing, adapting, and in the cracks between those daily routines, larger identities are forming. In that environment, sermons become more than sermons. A preacher can speak about greed in the clergy, and the crowd hears not only a moral warning, but a political accusation. A preacher can speak about true authority, and the crowd hears a question about whether bishops, nobles, or the king deserve obedience. A preacher can speak in Czech, and the crowd hears a message about belonging. Language is not neutral. Language is a flag. Wenceslaus does not always understand how quickly these emotions can harden. He thinks in terms of court advantage, of which faction supports him today, of which noble must be appeased this week. But the city is changing in ways that do not wait for court decisions. People are beginning to imagine that faith, identity, and political rights can belong to a community, not only to a dynasty. This is not only academic politics. Universities are factories of clergy and administrators. Changing a university changes the future personnel of church and state. Wenceslaus's decision deepens the connection between Bohemian identity and reformist theology. It also increases the anger of those who feel excluded, strengthening opposition among German elites in and beyond Bohemia. Meanwhile, the church hierarchy responds with pressure. Wycliffe's writings are condemned in various contexts, and books associated with his ideas are targeted. Hus is criticized, then censured, then increasingly pushed toward the edge of acceptable discourse. Tensions spill into the streets. When religious authority attempts to silence reform preaching, the effect can be the opposite. Crowds interpret suppression as proof that the reformers are right about corruption. Wenceslaus is caught between factions: urban reform-minded supporters, some university figures, and parts of the population on one side, traditional nobles and ecclesiastical authorities on the other, and beyond Bohemia, the broader imperial world watching with suspicion. In addition to all this, Wenceslaus's imperial standing is collapsing. As king of the Romans, he is expected to manage disputes across the German lands, convene assemblies, mediate conflicts, respond to crises, and maintain the empire's coherence. Yet Wenceslaus spends much of his energy in Bohemia and appears disengaged from imperial governance. Electors and princes grow irritated. They complain that he is absent, negligent, and ineffective. There is another symbolic failure hanging over him as well. He never obtains the full imperial coronation in Rome that would complete the imperial arc in the traditional imagination. Whether because of politics, logistics, or lack of urgency, the step is never taken. In a system that depends on ritual legitimacy, missing such a ritual leaves an opening for doubt. By 1400, that doubt becomes action. A coalition of prince-electors convenes and declares Wenceslaus deposed as king of the Romans. In his place, they elect Rupert of the Palatinate. This is extraordinary. Deposition in the Holy Roman Empire is rare, and it signals the depth of frustration. Wenceslaus is not removed by a foreign conqueror. He is removed by the political consensus of his peers, the very class of men whose support he needed to rule. Wenceslaus refuses to accept the deposition. He continues to style himself as king of the Romans in his own documents. He retains Bohemia. In practice, however, the rupture is real. Imperial politics move forward without him, and the rupture creates further complications. Rupert struggles to command universal recognition and to manage imperial problems, especially in Italy and among rival factions. When Rupert dies, in 1410, the imperial scene becomes a contest of competing claims. Electors split, different candidates are chosen. A man like Jobst of Moravia briefly appears in the contest, only to die soon after. Eventually, Sigismund, who has already built power in Hungary, maneuvers into the kingship of the Romans. The imperial contest after Rupert's death is the kind of situation that reveals how different the empire is from a centralized kingdom. Electors can split into camps, each claiming legality. One group can proclaim one king, while another group proclaims another, and for a time both claims can hang in the air. Cities and princes then choose which claim to recognize, often based less on abstract legality and more on practical benefit. For Wenceslaus, this period offers a strange mixture of revenge and exhaustion. On one hand, the very people who removed him are now divided and unstable, proving that his deposition did not magically create order. On the other hand, he has neither the energy nor the political network to seize the moment fully. His authority in the German lands has been neglected for too long. He can still issue titles and letters, but issuing letters is not the same as leading armies, attending diets, and settling disputes in person. When Jobst of Moravia appears briefly as a rival king, it hints at what the empire is becoming, a chessboard where different branches of elite families can claim legitimacy if they can gather enough support. When Jobst dies, Sigismund's position strengthens, because Sigismund has something Wenceslaus lacks at this stage momentum. Sigismund has built alliances in Hungary, he has practiced leadership in crisis, and he has the ambition to step onto the imperial stage. In time, Wenceslaus makes a pragmatic bargain. He accepts that the imperial center has moved away from him, and he focuses on holding Bohemia, where his hereditary right is stronger and where the crown still carries deep weight. It is not a heroic choice. It is a survival choice. But survival choices can shape history as much as heroic ones, because they determine where the remaining power will be spent. In this chaos, Wenceslaus does something that reveals both his stubbornness and his realism. He maintains his self-image as legitimate, but he also recognizes that fighting endlessly for an imperial title he cannot effectively use will drain Bohemia further. Over time, he reaches arrangements that allow him to keep Bohemia and retain prestige while acknowledging the shifting imperial reality. While these imperial contests churn, Wenceslaus grows more inward. Prague remains his center. Hunting and court life remain his comforts. Governance continues, but often through others, and not always with coherence. His circle of favorites and advisors continues to provoke noble resentment. His relationship with Sigismund grows more complicated, and then comes another dramatic episode, one that shows how fragile kingship has become for him. In 1402, Sigismund captures Wenceslaus. The circumstances are tied to political maneuvering and disputes over power, and Sigismund presents himself as acting for stability. Whatever the justification, the reality is stark. Wenceslaus is imprisoned again, this time by his own half-brother, a man who will later rise to great imperial prominence. Imagine the humiliation. A king who once stood in Aachen with a crown, now held under guard, his letters controlled, his decisions made by others. For months he is removed from the center, and the realm is forced to adapt without him. That adaptation is dangerous, because when a kingdom learns it can function without the king becomes easier to ignore. Wenceslaus's captivity lasts many months. He is held under guard, moved between secure locations, and effectively removed from power. Eventually he escapes or is released under complicated circumstances, and he returns to Bohemia. But the damage deepens. Each time he is captured, each time he is forced into concessions, his aura weakens. A king who can be grabbed is a king whose authority is negotiable. Meanwhile, the religious situation in Bohemia grows more combustible. There is another layer to Wenceslaus's reign that often gets overlooked because it is quieter than coups and councils, the day-to-day business of keeping a kingdom running. Bohemia needs roads maintained, tolls regulated, markets protected, coins minted, and disputes judged. In an age where people still remember famine seasons and fear sudden raids, stability is not abstract. It is the difference between a household surviving winter and a household collapsing. Wenceslaus has moments where he tries to impose order. He issues rulings, grants privileges to towns, and sometimes leans on urban groups as a counterweight to hostile nobles. Cities can be loyal to a king because they want protection from aristocratic intimidation. A king can be loyal to cities because he wants taxes and support. This relationship, however, requires consistent attention. A city that is protected one year and ignored the next loses trust. Wenceslaus's inconsistency makes even potentially loyal partners anxious. His personal temperament also affects justice. Medieval justice is often personal. People petition the king. They hope for mercy, for a ruling, for intervention. A ruler who enjoys hearing petitions can strengthen loyalty. A ruler who grows impatient or retreats into private life leaves petitioners to the mercy of local powers. The more Wenceslaus withdraws, the more local lords fill the space, and the more the kingdom becomes uneven, harsh in one region, lenient in another, predictable nowhere. This unevenness is one reason reform preaching becomes so potent. When people experience injustice that feels random, they become hungry for moral clarity. A preacher who speaks about righteousness and corruption is not speaking into a vacuum. He is speaking into lived frustration. The church's broader crisis continues. The schism produces rival popes and competing claims. Political leaders across Europe maneuver around those claims. In this environment, spiritual authority becomes entangled with political alliances in a way that feels cynical to many believers. In 1412, a major flashpoint erupts over indulgences. An indulgence, in medieval Catholic practice, is connected to the church's authority to remit certain spiritual penalties under specific conditions. But indulgences become controversial when they are used as fundraising tools, especially to finance wars and political projects. When an indulgence campaign is launched and promoted in Prague, Hus denounces it sharply as corrupt and contrary to the spirit of Christian humility. This is where Wenceslaus shifts. Under pressure from church authorities and political realities, he moves against Hus's agitation. Whether out of genuine concern for order, fear of international consequences, or simple exhaustion with unrest, Wenceslaus orders restraint. Hus refuses to be silenced. The city becomes tense. An interdict is threatened or imposed at times, meaning religious services and sacraments in Prague are restricted, a heavy pressure on ordinary believers. Hus chooses to leave Prague to avoid escalating violence, retreating to the countryside while his ideas continue to circulate. Wenceslaus's pattern repeats: tolerate, then withdraw. Allow a flame, then try to smother it after it has already spread. At the same time, Wenceslaus's court life continues with its own contradictory culture. He is not simply a man who does nothing. He is a patron in certain ways. Luxurious manuscripts associated with his reign are produced, richly illuminated, reflecting court taste and prestige. His court supports artists and craftsmen. Prague remains a center of culture in Central Europe. If you want to understand why hunting appears so often in accounts of him, remember that hunting is not only leisure, it is also a language of status. A king who rides out with dogs, horns, and a retinue is displaying power over land and over time. He is showing that he can leave the city and still be obeyed. He is surrounding himself with companions who feel like a chosen inner circle. For Wenceslaus, hunting also offers something the council chamber does not: clear rules, immediate action, and a world that does not argue back in Latin legal phrases. But when a king takes refuge in the clarity of the forest, the kingdom experiences something else: absence. Deputies decide matters, factions whisper, grievances pile up, and the very activity that is meant to display control begins to symbolize withdrawal. But culture does not substitute for governance when the political roof is leaking. A beautifully illuminated page cannot stop a noble faction from plotting. A feast cannot repair a broken trust. A hunting triumph cannot quiet a city that believes it has been spiritually betrayed. While Wenceslaus drifts, Sigismund rises. Sigismund becomes a central figure in efforts to end the church schism. He positions himself as a mediator and organizer, the kind of leader who can convene councils, manage factions, and claim the mantle of restoring unity. His political competence and ambition stand in contrast to Wenceslaus's inconsistency. This contrast becomes painfully clear during the Council of Constance, held from 1414 to 1418. The council's purpose includes resolving the schism and addressing reform and heresy issues. It becomes the stage where Jan Hus is summoned and ultimately condemned. Hus travels to Constance under promises of safe conduct, but the environment is hostile. The council views his teachings as dangerous to church unity. Hus is tried, condemned, and executed in 1415. For Bohemia, Hus's death is not simply the removal of a preacher, it is an explosion. It turns reformist sympathy into outrage. It transforms theological debate into a national and political crisis. Many in Bohemia interpret Hus as a martyr, a symbol of Czech religious identity and resistance against external domination. Wenceslaus is still king of Bohemia during this period, but his ability to steer events is limited. He has spent years weakening his own authority. He has allowed factions to harden. He has not built a stable consensus. And now, a society already tense with economic shifts and political resentment is inflamed by religious fury. The streets of Prague become a place where sermons can act like weapons. Processions become demonstrations. Symbols become rallying points. Clergy and city officials become targets of anger. Nobles and towns take sides. The kingdom begins to split into camps, not only about theology, but about power and identity. Wenceslaus's court is caught in a storm it cannot command. As tensions rise, one of the most dramatic and iconic events in Bohemian history occurs: the First Defenestration of Prague. In 1419, the word defenestration sounds almost clinical, but the act is violent and symbolic. A group of radical reformers, led by intense preachers and supported by armed townsmen, storms the new town hall. They accuse officials of injustice and betrayal. In the chaos, several are thrown from a window. The act is meant to announce, in the most public way possible, that the old order has lost legitimacy. It is a declaration by force that authority will be contested not only in councils but in streets. News reaches Wenceslaus. Accounts differ on the exact emotional moment, but the event shocks him deeply. Some describe him as overcome by anger or stress. Others point to declining health. What matters is the outcome. On August 16, 1419, Wenceslaus dies at the age of 58. His death is not the end of the crisis. It is the removal of a weak center that had been barely holding the kingdom together. Without him, the conflict bursts outward. The Hussite Wars begin. These wars are not one simple conflict. They are a series of uprisings, crusades, civil struggles, and ideological battles that engulf Bohemia and spill into neighboring lands. They are fought with weapons and with words, with armies and with pamphlets, with fortifications and with sermons. They last for years and reshape Central Europe. At the heart of these wars are competing visions of Christian life and political authority. On one side are the Hussites, themselves divided into moderates and radicals, each with different priorities and methods. On the other side are papal and imperial forces, as well as local elites who fear the social and religious upheaval that Hussite reform implies. Sigismund, now positioned as a major imperial figure, becomes a key opponent of the Hussite movement, seeking to claim Bohemia and restore order under a model that the reformers reject. When you look at this, you might be tempted to say Wenceslaus caused it all. That would be too simple. The forces driving Bohemia toward upheaval are larger than one man: economic change after plague, growth of cities, rising literacy, university debates, tensions between Czech and German elites, corruption scandals in the church, the shock of the schism, and the broader European transition toward a new intellectual climate. But Wenceslaus matters because he fails to manage these forces, and because his failures create a vacuum. He does not invent religious dissent, but he allows it to grow without clear strategy. He does not create noble resentment, but he feeds it through favoritism and unpredictability. He does not begin imperial fragmentation, but he accelerates it through absence and disengagement. His reign becomes the kind of reign where problems do not get solved, they get postponed, and postponement becomes fuel. So what kind of man is Wenceslaus IV, when we strip away the extremes of legend? He is, above all, a contradiction. He is intelligent enough to understand sharp details, but not consistent enough to build long-term policy. He can be charming, but also withdrawn. He can be decisive in bursts, but often retreats into silence or distraction. He loves the pleasures of court life, especially hunting, and he relies on companions he trusts personally, even when their presence inflames political tension. He resents the constraints placed upon him by nobles and clerics, but he also depends on them to govern. He inherits the finest political architecture in Central Europe and fails to maintain it with the steady care it requires. In other words, he is not a cartoon villain and not a simple incompetent. He is a ruler whose temperament does not match the demands of his position. And in the late medieval world, temperament can decide the fate of regions. It is worth pausing on the shadow of his father again, because that shadow is part of the tragedy. Charles IV is remembered as a builder of Prague, of institutions, of law. Wenceslaus is remembered as a ruler under siege, by nobles, by church crises, by reform movements, by imperial electors, and even by his own family. People compare them, and comparison becomes cruelty. The son can rarely look good beside such a father. But history's harshest moments often happen not when a kingdom has a weak ruler in isolation, but when a kingdom has a weak ruler after a strong one. Under a strong ruler, elites adapt and cooperate because resistance seems risky. Under a weaker successor, those elites test boundaries. Old complaints become bold demands. Ambitious relatives see openings. The very stability created by the strong ruler becomes a platform from which the next crisis leaps. Bohemia under Charles IV becomes so central, so prosperous, and so confident that when Wenceslaus struggles, the fall feels sharper. Now, think about the daily reality in his kingdom. Prague is full of life. Merchants, craftsmen, clerics, students, nobles, and foreign visitors. The university debates theology and philosophy. The city's churches shape public life, and sermons can mobilize neighborhoods. Outside the city, villages work fields and pay dues, while nobles manage estates and compete for influence. Mining regions produce silver, which draws officials, investors, and disputes over rights and taxation. Money circulates. Urban classes grow more assertive. Bohemia is not a sleepy backwater. It is a dynamic kingdom where change is constant, and constant change demands constant leadership. In such a society, a king must be more than a symbol. He must be a referee, a manager, and a presence. He must know when to compromise and when to enforce. He must convene assemblies, listen to grievances, and build coalitions broad enough to survive storms. Wenceslaus often does not do this consistently. Sometimes he acts, sometimes he withdraws, sometimes he protects reformers, sometimes he abandons them. Sometimes he clashes with nobles, sometimes he yields. The result is not stability, but uncertainty, and uncertainty invites power grabs. This is also where Sigismund's role becomes so significant. Sigismund understands uncertainty as opportunity. He negotiates, he captures, he mediates, he claims legitimacy. He turns himself into the man who can fix crises, and by fixing them he gains authority. Wenceslaus, meanwhile, becomes the man crises happen around. Even his marriages reflect the world he lives in, where unions are political tools. He is married first to Joanna of Bavaria, a match that ties him into important networks. After her death, he marries Sophia of Bavaria. These queens are not merely private companions, they are figures in court politics, patrons, intermediaries, and symbols. Yet even with such connections, Wenceslaus struggles to build stable loyalty. There is also the matter of how Wenceslaus is portrayed by contemporaries and later writers. Medieval politics is filled with moral storytelling. If a ruler fails, chroniclers often explain failure through moral weakness, laziness, indulgence, drunkenness, or cruelty. Those traits may be partly true, partly exaggerated, and partly narrative convenience. It is easier to blame a personality than to explain complex structural change. So when you hear that Wenceslaus drank heavily, or that he was erratic, or that he was dominated by favorites, you should hear it with a balanced mind. Some of it is likely real, some of it is political smear. Some of it is a society trying to explain why the father system did not produce the expected continuity. Yet even after all caution, one fact remains. He is deposed as king of the Romans, captured in political coups, and dies on the eve of revolutionary war. Those outcomes do not happen to a ruler who is firmly in control. So where does his legacy lie? His legacy is not one of secure governance, but it is historically decisive. Under Wenceslaus, Bohemia becomes the stage where deep questions break into open conflict. Questions about church authority, about the language of worship, about corruption and reform, about the relationship between scripture and institution, about who has the right to interpret faith, and about whether political authority can be separated from spiritual legitimacy. In that sense, his reign is a doorway. It opens into the Hussite era, which anticipates later European religious conflicts and reforms. The Hussite movement becomes a warning and a prophecy. A warning to rulers who think religious dissent can be managed as a small court faction, and a prophecy of the storms that will later sweep across Europe. Wenceslaus himself is not the architect of this future, but he is the ruler under whom the ground cracks. He is also a reminder that political systems built by genius can still be fragile when inherited by a personality less suited to the system's demands. Charles IV's careful machine depends on constant maintenance. Wenceslaus does not provide that maintenance. The machine stutters, then breaks. And then, after his death, the pieces are fought over. If you want to imagine his final years, imagine a king in a castle, hearing rumors from Prague's streets, hearing reports from nobles, hearing clerical disputes, hearing that sermons are turning into demonstrations. Imagine a man who has already been humiliated by capture and deposition, who has already seen his half-brother rise, who has already watched reform debates ignite. Imagine him trying to feel like a king while knowing that kingship is no longer unquestioned. Then the windows of the new town hall become the stage of violence, and the king's body cannot bear the strain. It is a grim ending, and it leads into even grimmer years for Bohemia. But it also reveals something enduring about history. Societies do not usually collapse because of one event. They collapse because tensions accumulate until one event becomes the spark. Under Wenceslaus IV, Bohemia accumulates tension. Noble resentment, church crisis, economic shifts, national identity strain, and theological revolution. The spark comes in 1419. The fire follows, and yet, the story is not only collapse. It is also transformation. The Hussite period forces Europe to confront questions it would have preferred to postpone. It shows that a reform movement can become a national cause. It shows that church condemnation can create martyrs rather than silence. It shows that a king who hesitates can unintentionally clear the stage for radical change. In that sense, Wenceslaus is a king who loses control, but he reigns at the edge of a new world. His life sits between medieval order and early modern fracture. He inherits a universe where legitimacy is anchored in sacred ritual, noble privilege, and imperial tradition. He dies as that universe begins to splinter under pressures that will reshape Europe. And there is a final irony worth holding in mind. Wenceslaus is often remembered as a weak king, and in many ways he is. Yet weakness can be historically powerful. A strong ruler can delay conflict by forcing compromise. A weak ruler can allow hidden conflicts to surface, and once surfaced, they can transform the world. Bohemia's reform movement does not stay local. It teaches Europe that religious ideas can mobilize whole populations. It teaches rulers that councils and decrees cannot simply command belief. It teaches communities that identity can be defended with extraordinary intensity. In later centuries, when Europe experiences wider religious reform, people look back and see early outlines in Bohemia, the emphasis on preaching, the appeal to scripture, the critique of clerical corruption, and the willingness of communities to defend their convictions. Wenceslaus does not design these outlines. He merely governs while they are drawn. So the next time you hear the carol's name, remember the other Wenceslaus. Not a saint in snow, but a ruler in a storm, crowned in Aachen, raised in Prague, deposed by electors, captured by nobles and by his own brother, and finally overtaken by the religious revolution that his indecision helped unleash. That is the story of Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, a king of immense titles and fragile power, a man whose reign becomes the threshold of the Hussite age, and a reminder that history is often made not only by great builders like Charles IV, but also by the heirs, who cannot hold what they inherit. Tonight's story comes to an end here, but the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments